Is Jean Maria Arrigo. She's a social psychologist, member of the American Psychological Association 2005 Task Force on Ethical Guidelines for Psychologists in Interrogations. She's worked tirelessly and very, very hard in this, and I think we ought to give her a real round of applause for what she's been doing.
This is the fiction that I worked tirelessly. Okay.
Okay. I believe it. So I'm just delighted you're here.
He meant I kept doing it. Okay. So we have these agitators here who want the faculty and the students of all the law schools, right, to take up these issues. Well, the psychologists have been doing this for the last 5 years. And so maybe our lesson will help you a little bit. I can't say that the result has been very good, but we're always on the edge of prosecuting the big guys, okay? You know, I'm mom, right? I can't tell you about the depth of these investigations. It's all secret and everything, right? So we've been on the edge like this for about 4 years. So maybe it will come out with the help of attorneys. But anyway, even though the lawyers here are taking credit, as it were, for are taking credit for the torture, the psychologists are at least in a good second position. And the reason is that when the government lawyers reformulated the definition of torture, you know, for U.S. law, they said it wasn't enough, you know, that somebody had to be hurt in certain ways and for certain purposes, but the person who was hurting them had to have a specific intent to hurt the person. Well, who knows about intentions? Well, psychologists. So you have to have psychologists there who are going to say the intent was not really to hurt the person, the intent was to get such and such information. Also, it doesn't count as torture if you've just caused a person a lot of pain and suffering. It has to go forward into time for a long time. It has to be an enduring kind of suffering. And who can tell you about that is a psychologist. So psychologists said, for instance, waterboarding doesn't do that. I went through survival resistance, escape, and whatever it was, training myself. I was waterboarded, and it made me a better man. Okay? So that is actually what Bryce Lefevre said, who was on the commission with me. So psychologists are really in on this. I think that the missing voice here is the voice of interrogators, the people who have been trained and expert before 9/11. And one reason we need their voices is because psychologists are purporting to improve on their work, and attorneys are purporting to give them boundaries. You know, so who are these people? What have they got to say? Well, first of all, in the Army at least, which the Army takes most of the prisoners, so they do most of the interrogation, for the last, 20 years or so, interrogators on the whole, haven't had ranks above warrant officer, which means they would be below lieutenant and everybody else, okay? So they're in a kind of humble position given the hierarchical situation of the military. And of course, given their positions as intelligence officers, it's also very difficult for them to speak out. They're not in the habit of speaking to news media. That's the worst thing you can do as an intelligence officer, is speak to the news media, okay? They're not in the habit of getting on with NGOs, right? And in fact, in 2006, 20 former U.S. Army interrogators and interrogator technicians sent an open letter to the House Committee on the Armed Services talking about how counterproductive this torture course of interrogation was. Another 15 of senior interrogators and intel professionals, some of whom I know, under the auspices of Human Rights First, that shows you how desperate they were, okay, actually had meetings with Congress in 2008, with members of Congress, to protest this. Because I was one of the founders of the International Intelligence Ethics Association. I know a lot of military intelligence people. And one of these former interrogators and interrogation trainers came to me and said, what we need is some psychologists to tell us, to explain in psychological terms why non-coercive interrogation is more effective than coercive interrogation. Because those people won't listen to us, you know, we need psychologists. So we got together some interrogation trainers, including people who'd run SEER schools and set them up, and a bunch of research psychologists. We met for 3 days, and we tried to give an explanation. We did. We put it in a journal and so on. Not that it made any difference, you could say. But they told us how SEER training worked. They ran us through the 16 weeks of the Fort Huachuca school for new intelligence officers, a few weeks of which are devoted to interrogation. And where they really differed from these behavioral science consultation team psychologists, the so-called biscuit psychologists that the Bush administration sent into the interrogation sites, what they wanted from psychologists and what they thought was really, really important is enabling the interrogator. They wanted the detainee, or they called him the source, to have all of his cognitive faculties there, so he could remember things and get it right. And they wanted the guy to be well treated, so they could get cooperation out of him. What they were interested in for themselves is to have training for themselves. What works for an interrogator, as I said, is maturity, self-mastery of a kind that most of us don't have, okay? Tolerance, what psychologists call cognitive integrative complexity. That means that you can have your worldview, you can deal with somebody else in another worldview, you can actually talk and negotiate there. This is the complete opposite of you're either with us or you're against us, okay? Complete opposite of that thinking. That is like zero cognitive integrative complexity. So you have to have all of this tolerance, and they generally do not fit into the military model very well, okay? So they're outsiders in some ways, not people that Rumsfeld would probably like to ask for advice. So they gave examples of their different interrogation strategies. One of them said, well, everybody wants to talk to somebody. My job is to become the person you want to talk to. And believe me, he did it. Okay, I was still talking to him. Another person took a kind of existential position, you know. Here we are in this room, you and me, you know, we're just small people in big systems, right? Your enemy system, my enemy system. What realistically are the options that we have here? Okay, so people had different kinds of approaches like that. One of them was asked in a public meeting where I was, well, how do you define torture? And his response was, and they all agreed, I don't care how you define torture because it isn't useful for me to go anywhere close to that. Okay? So that was their picture of the interrogator who has all this capacity. And when you hear them, it sounds more or less like other kinds of expertise, you know, like for medical diagnosis or chest pain or whatever. It takes 10 years to get it, to really get it. You have to have close mentorship, all the same. Now, I'm going to contrast this with the biscuits, the behavioral science consultation team psychologists, whose effort was all devoted not to improving, enhancing the interrogator, but to disabling the source or the detainee, right? Completely different. Who were the interrogators that were working with down at Guantanamo? These were people who'd maybe gone through the course at Fort Huachuca, were new, were very young. So the interrogators that I talked to, they thought that this was completely asinine. We have here the detainees who are supposed to be the worst of the worst, right? And who we send out there are the most naive, inexperienced interrogators without their mentors, right? Well, no surprise they need some help, okay? Well, maybe psychologists are sent in to help them. But for this social skills model, the traditional social skills model that the senior interrogators use, the reason it works is because you're actually one of the good guys. You're actually wearing a white hat, okay? If you're going to be one of the bad guys, that isn't going to work. Or if you're going to be stupid, it's not going to work. So, or inexperienced, maybe I should say. So that was the kind of play-off we have here. Now, when the American Psychological Association gets involved in this, they are supporting the biscuit psychologists. Why is this? Well, there's a very, very long history of the American Psychological Association, and I don't want to just say the military, but the whole, you know, national security complex.